Hello and welcome everyone to our conversation on Pakistan's economy with Professor Atif Mian. I'm Zainab Amjad. I'm a second year MPA at Princeton at the School of Public and International Affairs, focusing on international development. Most of the people in the room here do know Professor Atif Mian, but for the benefit of, I think, the hundreds of people who are joining us on this webinar today, I'll introduce him and then talk about how we're going to run this session. Professor Atif Mian is John H. Lappert Jr., class of 1967, professor of economics, public policy, and finance at Princeton University, and director of the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. He has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. His work studies the connection between finance and macroeconomy. His latest book, House of Debt with Amir Sufi, builds upon powerful new data to describe how debt precipitated the Great Recession. His research also appears in top academic journals like the American Economic Review and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes in conversation with Professor Mian and open it up to questions from the audience afterwards. But please keep your questions coming in. We'll be monitoring the chat and then later on selecting questions for discussion. So to start us off, Professor Mian, I wanted to ask you, the fundamental question, which is Pakistan has had subpar growth over the last many decades, with countries such as Bangladesh and India demonstrating higher growth. Why is Pakistan economically behind in the region?
First of all, thank you, Zainab, for organizing this. It's always wonderful to talk to students, especially from Pakistan. The question, Zainab, that you've asked is obviously the most important one for Pakistan right now. And it's important to get the diagnosis of what ails Pakistan's economy right, because otherwise, if you don't know what the problem is, you're kind of throwing darts at random, and it's unlikely to have a positive result. As I look at the situation regarding Pakistan's economy, we can start from where we are right now, and or look at the last 3 years. We know when the previous government came into power, they had a tough time because of excesses of external account from the previous government. And there was negative growth initially, then COVID hit, so growth remained 0 to negative in per capita terms. However, as COVID started to recede, we see an uptick in growth in Pakistan. Now, what's interesting is that as soon as we start to see an uptick in growth, we see something else as well. And it is that something else which I really want to pay attention to as we move along. What we start to see is that Pakistan's current account deficit starts to increase as well. So current account deficit, for those who may not know this technical term, refers to the excess of imports, overall imports of a country over and above what it is able to sell to the rest of the world and what is able to earn through remittances in Pakistan's case. So as the economy attempted to grow, I would say, the current account deficit became larger. And just to put this in perspective, if you look at the current fiscal year, which ends in June, Pakistan is on pace to have a current account deficit of 18, perhaps even $20 billion. Now, that's a very large amount for a country of Pakistan's size. And in the face of such a high level of current account deficit, you cannot sustain it forever. So a few things must happen. And we've already seen that start in Pakistan. First of all, the exchange rate starts to devalue naturally. That makes your imports more expensive. And since by definition, you're a country that's importing a lot, that feeds into inflation. So you start having high inflation as a result of high current account deficits. The other thing that has to happen is that central bank, in order to protect its currency and also to dampen current account deficit, it has to, or it is forced to, raise domestic interest rates. And once again, we have seen the central bank respond aggressively, raising rates by 2.5 percentage points very recently. A natural result of the rise in interest rates is that the domestic economy tends to contract. And it's, in a way, it's by design, because the only way in the short run to put current account back into balance is for the economy to slow down in a way. And so here we have this situation that because of this external balance of payment issue, we sort of have to slow down the economy, if you want to think of it that way. And that is quite telling. Now, I just talked about what the situation is right now, but you can go back 4 to 5 years and we can, talk about the last year of, let's say, the PMLN regime. And it would be exactly the same situation. We would be at that time running a current account deficit clipping at $20 billion a year, again, unsustainable. And that also led to exactly the same set of dynamics: large exchange rate devaluation, raising of interest rates, and as a result, contraction of the domestic economy. Let's zoom out a bit. What I've just described you, these two events are actually by no means the only two events that Pakistan has faced. In fact, over the last 50 years, we have had at least 13 such episodes. So pretty much it's a regular occurrence. Every 3 to 4 years, Pakistan has this chronic balance of payment problem, which then forces the economy to react negatively in order to contain this otherwise unsustainable gap that we have relative to the rest of the world. So this, Zainab, going back to your question, I would say that we can obviously dig deeper, and we need to dig deeper. But if you want to understand the proximate cause for what prevents Pakistan's economy to grow at a pace that other economies have grown, I would say that one sort of proximate problem that we have is this chronic balance of payment problem. To put it differently, I would say this is for Pakistan to grow, it is a necessary condition that Pakistan solves this chronic balance of payment problem. So that's how I would see the situation.
Thank you for sharing, Professor Mian. I would like to zoom in on the balance of payment crisis a little bit more. And I want to understand why the balance of payment crisis inflicts Pakistan a bit more than countries like, let's say, India or China.
Right. So as I said, it's only a proximate cause. Obviously, you want to understand why Pakistan has this repeated problem of current account imbalances, when, as you said, other countries like China, obviously, but even countries like Bangladesh and India do not have these kind of issues. They don't go to IMF as repeatedly as we do. And that, to answer that question, we have to dig deeper into the structure of the economy. And when you do that, in my view, what you realize is that Pakistan has a fundamentally unsustainable growth model. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that with a few examples. If you look around the country and you ask yourself, what are the big businesses through which people make money? Like, just ask yourself that question. And the kind of businesses that come to mind is, one, it would be real estate. So people make a lot of money through appreciation in the value of land that they hold. And so they trade that, they make money, and then they obviously sort of consume the capital gains that comes out of that. Now, just think for a moment what that means at the macro level for the economy. When you generate a lot of sort of value, so to speak, from land speculation, real estate development in general, that tends to be, from a GDP perspective, quite an unproductive exercise. Number two, the reason you're earning all that value from owning land has to do with the activities, the relatively more productive activities that other people are doing who are also occupying that land around you. But since you have sort of a monopoly right over the land that you own, whoever ends up owning the land gets disproportionate benefit from those relatively more productive activities that are happening around them. In a way, land acts as a rent-seeking device, if you will, in such an economy. Now, what ends up happening is that when a lot of the value in the economy is generated through relatively unproductive means, such as land speculation that I've just described, it generates demand in the economy. So whoever is earning that money, they are obviously demanding goods and services. And a lot of it, because they tend to be richer people as well who own land, they put pressure on imports, and a lot of the demand is going to come from, they're going to buy cars, they're going to drive cars, that's going to require oil, they're going to buy consumer goods and so on. And all of that is going to put negative pressure on the imports. But now ask yourself the following question. through this kind of activity, are these individuals producing anything that can be sold to the rest of the world? And what you realize is, of course, real estate development, you can't sell real estate development to people sitting in New York because they're not interested in that. You'll have to produce something else, perhaps IT services, perhaps you'll have to manufacture cars or something like that to be able to sell to people in New York or elsewhere. And this is, in the sense, is a fundamental problem that Pakistan faces, that the value generation, the activities that generate value in Pakistan, they tend to be relatively unproductive. I can give you another example. The sugar industry, highly subsidized industry. Pakistan is a water scarce country. It does not make sense for Pakistan to be so intensive in the sugarcane industry, but we are, for political reasons, for the protection that this industry is given. And again, we can think of the value that this sector generates, again, kind of rents in the way I described earlier. And once again, because you are subsidizing a sector, Pakistani sugar, by and large, is not going to be competitive in the international world. So once again, you find yourself in the situation that you're creating demand, but through activities that do not sustain themselves by generating demand from the rest of the world for Pakistani goods and services. And so as a result of that, we constantly have this chronic imbalance between imports and exports. And actually this imbalance is extremely severe. Just to give you one number, Pakistan's imports tend to be twice as large as Pakistan's exports. Now that's a remarkable imbalance. The only way the country kind of survives in the long run is because we have remittances. Millions of Pakistanis working outside of Pakistan, they send foreign exchange back into the country, and it is that which again runs at a clip of around $25 billion a year that fills in a lot of the gap between imports and exports. But remittances are kind of fixed. They depend on how many people are currently working outside. When the economy grows, the additional value that you're generating, if that additional value tends to be from these relatively unproductive activities, like the one I just described to you, the natural consequence of that is going to be that on the margin, you're going to put downward pressure on current account. Because again, you're generating demand, that's going to put, you're going to raise imports, but you don't have as much to sell to the rest of the world. So another way to say all this is that Pakistan faces a serious productivity challenge, that the way we have wired the economy over the years, and again, it's partly related to politics, partly related to a lack of vision and so on and so forth. But the way we have ended up wiring the economy is such that growth, if we were to grow in the current structure, if we were to try to grow at the rates that Bangladesh and India would be growing, those rates would not be sustainable. So we need to change this fundamental the wiring of the economy that we have right now.
I have to say my macro and econ classes are really coming together, which is part of the reason why I reached out to Professor Mia for this talk. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to understand if you would say that this is a problem of elite capture that we're seeing in Pakistan.
So to some extent, the answer is yes, of course. I already mentioned the sugar example, and sugarcane is an industry where I think it's a bipartisan industry. So all politicians from all parties are heavily invested, and it's protected. And as I said, they don't pay for the water, and so that's not priced in it. And then there are other subsidies as well. So yes, we have an elite capture issue, and in particular, an elite that is remarkably unproductive, to go back to my earlier point. However, it's not to say that Pakistan is the only country with elite capture. And I think this is sort of an interesting point in my view. There is elite capture in a lot of other countries as well. Just to give you one example, if you look at China, I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of elite capture in China as well. People have documented that if you are connected to the Chinese Communist Party, for example, if you're politically well connected, you have a much better chance of being very successful when it comes to making a lot of money. Similarly, when you look at earlier history of Japan and Korea, connections, nepotism, it mattered a lot. And it's, in some sense, you could say even in Korea, there was quite a bit of elite capture. But there is one important difference between the kind of elite capture that we observe in Korea and China versus the kind of elite capture that we observe in Pakistan. and that is that the elite capture in China or Korea was largely in export-driven industries, whether it's Hyundai or other conglomerates and so on. So while it might put sort of upward pressure on income inequality and things of that nature, it might be bad for political economy, and we don't want that. Don't get me wrong. It's not to say that elite capture is good. What I'm trying to say is that Pakistan has a twin problem of not just an elite capture, but an elite capture of a particularly bad variety, where we end up having, as I mentioned, a remarkably unproductive elite. And so that, if you can at least change that while still having some elite capture, as other countries also have, I think even that would improve the situation.
So we've talked at length about policy problems. I want to talk a little bit more about policy solutions. And from your perspective, I want to hear more about how Pakistan can solve the chronic balance of payments problem.
Right. So in terms of solutions, I think, first of all, it's very important to have a vision of what needs to be done. And that's why we started off by talking about sort of diagnosing the problem, what it is. And as I said, it's really this chronic balance of payment problem that itself is then driven by this unproductive set of industries that we have bet ourselves on. So that needs to change. But in terms of policies looking forward, I would first of all start from macro policy, and before we get into the details of industrial policy and things of that nature. What do I mean by macro policy? Think of macroprudential regulations that a country like Pakistan needs to run. So, and I'm using this word broadly. Macroprudential regulation, more broadly defined, refers to the kind of exchange rate regime you're running. It refers to the kind of capital controls you may have or you may not have, how you sequence them. And it also refers to what you communicate to the rest of the world in terms of your future stance when it comes to exchange rate, when it comes to reserve accumulation, and so on. And that is the first area that Pakistan needs to communicate very strongly, that it has a new credible regime that has a macroprudential regulation along the following lines. First of all, exchange rate has to be flexible. We all know that, and Pakistan has moved in that direction recently, which is good. However, in the past, Pakistan has had serious issues where for long periods of time, an artificial exchange rate has been kind of imposed on the country with negative impact on exports. But then there are other elements of broader macroprudential policy that have not gone in the right direction. And one of them is capital account liberalization. For a country like Pakistan, you want to use your capital account very judiciously. Again, keeping that productivity mantra in mind, you want to encourage as much as possible investment coming from the outside, as long as that investment is kind of greenfield in nature, that it's starting new capital projects, number one. And number two, projects of a particular variety. So you don't necessarily want foreign investment that's building houses or real estate of that nature, again, because it's unproductive. You can't sell it back to the rest of the world. You want to define your rules of the game for foreign investment very narrowly. And this is exactly what China did. In fact, I would say just go and look at how China managed its capital account, how it sequenced its capital account liberalization policy. So capital account should be open for foreign investment that brings in technology, that brings in know-how on highly productive stuff, in particular stuff that you can then export to the rest of the world, because that will then start to have a positive impact on your balance of payment position. The flip side of that is that you do not want capital account liberalization for speculative capital, for portfolio investment more broadly. Certainly for real estate investment would be a terrible idea. And unfortunately, all of those are things that have happened in Pakistan in recent past in particular, and that does not help, because you first have to strengthen again your supply side by making it more productive before you can open up to this kind of risky speculative capital, because the nature of this risky speculative capital is that whenever things turn south globally, even if nothing is happening in Pakistan, there tends to be capital flight away from emerging and frontier markets like Pakistan, and you don't want to be exposed to that, because if you are, like we are today, the central bank will be forced to raise rates and all of the other things that I talked about in the very beginning. So you don't want a situation where you expose yourself unnecessarily to those risks. So you have to manage your capital account very carefully. The last thing I'll say on macroprudential policies is that we need to have a clear understanding of what remittances mean for Pakistan. Pakistan is a country for which remittances are a very large share of the economy, 10 percentage points of GDP, which is the highest among major economies. You know, Bangladesh, India, they're quite far behind. And in fact, remittances for Pakistan as a share of the economy have increased the most as well over the last 10, 20 years, again, when you compare it to Bangladesh and India. Now, for some strange reason, politicians and political parties in Pakistan, they tend to look at remittances or the rise in remittances as a positive sign for the economy. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's reflective of the fact that people can't find employment at home, so they're forced to go outside. There's a reason Pakistan's remittances are growing at a faster pace than India's or Bangladesh's, because those economies are doing better. And so, that's number one. I think it's important to understand what remittances mean. The other thing is an over-reliance of remittances at a scale for that Pakistan does. It can also be problematic from a macro perspective, because it can, for example, it can put in place forces that we refer to as the Dutch disease in economics. And that itself can put a drag on how competitive you are on the export market. So what does that mean? You obviously should not and cannot stop people from sending money back home. That's a good thing at the micro level. But at the macro level, you must contain the possible negative effects of that by instituting a policy that saves a fraction of those remittances in the current account. And that essentially means that Pakistan should adopt a policy where it runs moderate levels of positive current account surpluses. You can think of that as annually we should be saving a fraction of those remittances at the national level. What that would do is that would allow you to become financially more sustainable vis-a-vis this external balance. Because right now you're just ramping up on your negative external liabilities, which is not sustainable for all the reasons we've talked about before. So that's just one policy, but there are many others we need to do. And again, looking at the balance of payment situation, energy is the obvious one. Pakistan should have moved to alternative energy front very aggressively by investing in R&D, building those value chains like solar projects inside the country to generate electricity through renewables. And Pakistan has an excellent environment for renewable energy, solar in particular, but others, wind and hydro, of course. And all of those avenues should be exploited. In fact, something like solar, the advantage of solar energy is that it's quite modular. So you can have reasonably small scale efficient plants. So you can actually generate relatively small, medium business generation by incentivizing them to generate electricity through these means, which they can sell into the national grid. So it can be easily collateralized, that those kind of cash flows and projects. So that's the second area where Pakistan should be investing very heavily. There is one specific proposal, coming back to the problem of too much emphasis on capital gains from land, which is negative in nature at the macro level. We have a specific proposal, and that is that the country should have a system of taxation that taxes land, especially urban land. It could be based on the value of the land, or it could be a combination of that with capital gains on realized gains when you have land transactions. That revenue can then be used to fund urban infrastructure. And domestic firms need to be created that can then build the high rises, the water plants, the roads, the subways, all of the natural infrastructure that a modern city requires. The revenue that you raise from land taxes can be used to fund that infrastructure. It will have two key advantages. Number one, it will put downward pressure on this unproductive source of imports that I talked about earlier. So naturally, your balance of payment will start to move in the right direction when you start taxing the otherwise unproductive activity. So that's one. And it will force entrepreneurs to forget about making money through land. And they will be forced to invest in more productive sectors, such as manufacturing, such as services, and so on. So it will have that first major advantage. But then the second major advantage of such a policy would be that the revenue that we generate can be used to raise public investment in a very important sector, which is the development of cities, where a lot of the modern growth comes from. And the last thing I'll say on the policy front is investing in agriculture, and especially in investing in R&D in agriculture, where Pakistan has seriously lagged behind. And, obviously we're traditionally an agriculture focused country, and yet it's quite tragic how little investment has gone in. And so Pakistan needs to create centers of excellence from a research and development perspective, because agriculture is quite local in nature, actually. What kind of seeds, how to make water usage more efficient, how to use satellite data, how to use big data, how to embed agriculture with sort of the renewable energies and so on. There are so many opportunities there that Pakistan can exploit, because the capital is kind of already there. People, you have the farming community, you have land, you have the basic know-how. So it's something that can give quite quick gains to Pakistan if worked upon in an intelligent manner.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on policy solutions. I'm hearing you speak and just thinking about how policy often breaks down at the level of implementation, and that's really the test of whether a policy is going to work. So let's say we can redo the policy agenda of Pakistan. Where can implementation improve going forward?
Yeah, so implementation is a serious challenge everywhere, and certainly in the Pakistani context as well. I think when it comes to implementation, this is the time to go micro. So we've been talking about sort of macro issues and so on, but when it comes to implementation, you really have to focus on issues at a more micro level. So for example, the process of development, like I just talked about setting up R&D centers in agriculture. How can you do that? You can only do that if you first put in leadership positions very highly competent people. So that's your first challenge. Select a team of extremely talented and qualified individuals, men and women, that you then delegate authority to. And that's what I mean by put them in leadership positions. You delegate authority to them, and then you provide them the resources to get the job done. So that's sort of first kind of on the human capital side. And I think if you look at various things that have happened in Pakistan, and you look at the kind of people who have been put in charge, obviously they are very good people, exceptions are always there, but I would say by and large, the country has sort of, or the leadership, the political leadership, I would say, has failed in putting in place people in leadership. In fact, quite often leadership positions get unfilled for long periods of time, which makes absolutely no sense for a country like Pakistan. So that would be sort of one important input. The other, and again, now I'm talking about the society more broadly, we always criticize Pakistan. That's sort of, given the situation, it comes naturally. But I think it's important to highlight some positives as well. And one of those positives is what has happened to women's education in Pakistan. I think it's a remarkable achievement, which by and large largely reflects the efforts of the women and their families. But Pakistan has closed the gap between female and male literacy more broadly, but also on the quality dimension. It's remarkable how well women are doing. So when you look at, for example, the national exams, and you look at who gets the best grades and so on, girls and women are beating boys and men hands down. I would say 2-1 is kind of the score there. And I have also, by the way, see that at Princeton, right? When we look at admitted students from Pakistan, I think 4 out of every 5 tends to be a woman. So that tells you what is happening in Pakistan. Now, why am I bringing this up on the implementation side? Despite that fact, it is very tragic that Pakistan has one of the lowest labor force participation rates for women. So there is something happening where we are unable to take these talented women and put them into the labor force, certainly put them into leadership positions. And we need to overcome that gap. There is a lot of raw talent sitting there, basically just sitting to be used. And I think the country really needs to focus on improving the environment. And there are multiple issues. Obviously, we don't have the time to get into all of those details. But again, I think at the broader level, this is a big positive that Pakistan has. It's not being utilized properly. And so that's another thing where I would say, use this resource that the country has. I already talked about R&D, but at a very long run, broad level, when you talk about change, when you talk about growth, the one factor that dominates everything else is science and technology. Like, that's the basic fact. I mean, it's the force of science and technology that pushes economies, regardless of what the taxation rate might be, regardless of what political structures you might have. If you are innovating and if you are growing technologically, there is very little that can prevent you from growing. And so the flip side of that for a country that is not growing is invest in science and invest in the attitudes that lead to science, having a more open society, allowing people to question, which is really the fundamental of what scientific thinking and scientific breakthroughs are all about. So investment in science, technology, R&D in general, as I've mentioned earlier, all of those things should be of first importance. But it really starts from, I'll go back to the first point I made on implementation, which I think is the key. Sometimes people say personnel is policy, and that's everything. I mean, if you want to understand whether a government would be successful, just look at its first initial choice of the kind of people it puts in key positions. And you pretty much have a good idea of what's going to happen to this government going forward. So it's really important to pick wisely. Because if the person sitting at the top does not know what he or she is doing, then obviously it has major implications on follow-up of policy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've definitely learned so much in the past 30 minutes, but I need to stop asking questions and I need to make sure everyone else is getting to ask questions as well. So how about we take some questions from the room, Professor Mian, and then we can take questions from the chat.
Sure.
Does anyone have any questions?
Professor Mia, post-COVID, Pakistan's IT sector has resulted in a lot of gains. We've had some massive startups come in, they've been raising a lot of money. Do you think that could be a major boom for the economy like it did in India? Do you think that is what will close the productivity gap for us?
Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, certainly. So the question concerns IT sector in particular. Recently, there has been a lot of activity on startups and a lot of money has come in relatively, by Pakistani standards, high valuations of startups as well. Is that a good thing and so on? It's obviously a positive thing. IT sector is, unlike the other sectors like sugarcane and land that I was referring to, IT is a sector that is highly productive. And so any positive sign in the IT sector is a positive sign for Pakistan's overall economy. However, when we talk about valuation of startups, I think we need to understand what else is happening globally. Valuations are through the roof globally. And so part of that is a reflection of that global factor, if you will, and is not necessarily a statement about what is specially happening in Pakistan. And so that's why I'm not as enthused by those kind of valuations as I might otherwise would be if Pakistan was the go-to place for everyone and they were kind of leaving, whatever, Thailand and Indonesia and coming to Pakistan. That is not happening. So I think we really need to do a lot more to compete at that level. And also the other thing I'll say on the IT side is that scale is very important. So if you look at, for example, India, a remarkable success story on the IT side, especially early on, part of it is that they were able to do it at scale. You look at big cities like Bangalore and so on. We are not yet seeing that in Pakistan, that it's not happening at scale yet. And again, I think it's something to do things at scale, you need coordination with the government. And so that's something, but I think the positive signs are there. There is that the raw material is there that you can kind of work with going forward. But the emphasis has to change. And that's why I kind of started from the broader picture of, taxing the unproductive activities and facilitating the more productive activity. That's a fundamental shift, or kind of the fundamental message that I would like to give here.
Other questions?
Yes.
We have one more question.
So one question, I mean, it's kind of an obvious one. There's been a kind of lot of discussion about how much the absence of regional trade hurts Pakistan. And do you have a sense of the magnitude of the opportunity cost there, both in terms of lowering the cost of Pakistan's imports, but also giving Pakistani exports a potentially much bigger market? I mean, it's it's one of the least regionally integrated regions in the world in terms of trade, and how significant that might be as it keeps going ahead. I mean, I know it's politically sensitive.
Yeah.
But just in terms of kind of the analytical possibilities there.
Look, we know one thing when it comes to trade, which is that it's beneficial, right? I don't think anyone disagrees. We can talk about how to do it properly and things like that, but no one will disagree with the statement that trade benefits all parties involved. And so it is, as you said, a negative for everyone in the region that South Asia does not have the level of trade that it really should. As we all know, the reasons for that are all political. And so there, at a certain level, there is not much, certainly I don't have any expertise to say much on that. The only thing as an observer I would say is that if anything, I've become more pessimistic over time because of political developments on both sides of the border over the last 10, 15 years. And it's hard to imagine things reversing. I absolutely hope I'm wrong, but it's hard to imagine things improving anytime soon because so much, negative energy and emotions have been put into sort of building a narrative on this issue. We do have a lot to gain from trade. I do hope that we can move in that direction at some point. But coming back from Pakistan's perspective, the thing is Pakistan cannot wait for that to happen. And so it has to find other ways of managing growth and growing out of these issues. The other thing is, my sense is that the more Pakistan grows, actually, the quicker we are actually going to see opening up of trade, because the very natural reason for countries to trade is that there's something the other side has to offer and so on and so forth. So the bigger the economy is, the more it has to offer and so on. So I think from that perspective, actually, I think if as a citizen of South Asia, I think it is to our collective advantage that we grow, all of us grow, and all of us grow uniformly. I think that is a more positive thing for the region.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Okay, one more.
I was wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit why investing in real estate is so much more profitable than investing in some productive structure or the stock market. Is it because property rights are better enforced on the real estate than in other productive capacity, or what is the underlying reason?
Yeah, that's.
My second question is, if it's really about the currency, why don't we devalue the currency further? And of course, it will lead to a high inflation in the short term. But if it's mostly what the rich consume, it's not affecting what the average consumption basket is for the poor people, then it should be fine, I think. So just to solve the current account.
Yeah. So
sorry, would you mind repeating the
yeah,
question?
I will. So the second question was, why can Pakistan not solve its balance of payment problem just by devaluing the currency? Now, devaluing the currency obviously helps. It helps to put downward pressure on current account. That is true. But one problem with that is that if you do it one time, but you don't have a credible policy that you will continue to do that in the future. And that's why I mentioned the credibility of putting a macroprudential regime. So that's definitely one factor that has been missing in the past, that we have had these regimes where, okay, you devalued, but if you're not credibly saying, okay, you know what, we are not going to allow for real exchange rate appreciation for consistent periods of time in the future, then people who want to make long-term investments in the export sector would be more willing to do those. That has been missing. So that's problem number one. I think problem number two is that just exchange rate by itself is not sufficient. You need, and if you look at export-oriented economies, you'll always find that the government also quite explicitly helps, facilitates, subsidizes, whatever you want to call it, investment in those export sectors. So, it might there might be some state-owned enterprises that do the sort of the steels of the world that private sector will not have the bandwidth to do, for example. So that's the other piece that has to be combined with an exchange rate policy, which is credibly committing to flexible exchange rate in the long run. And both of those things have been missing in Pakistan's case. We've always tried to control the exchange rate, and so that's why people are not, you just let it go when you're forced to let it go, kind of a thing. Your other question was what is specific about land that I think part of it is an absence of a tax regime that taxes at least some sort of rationalized value of land is taxed to, to a degree where, for example, land might be taxed here in the US. So we don't have those kind of regimes. But the other is exactly what you said, that it is an asset which is sort of most pledgeable, most collateralizable, where property rights are not the best, but you can still feel more comfortable owning a piece of land as opposed to owning a piece of capital in an export sector or a firm, for that matter. So all of those are obviously reasons that have collectively led to this situation. But what is really, I mean, that's why I was comparing the elite in Pakistan versus these other countries. It's really the absence of creating an alternative and putting some negative cost on the relatively unproductive sector. You'll have to do both to really start a process which is more positive in terms of the future dynamics of the economy.
I think the online audience has been very patient. How about we take some questions from people online?
Sure. There are 93 questions.
93 questions. Hassan and Fatma, would you mind sharing some questions with us?
So the first question we can ask is, what are the initial steps a new government should take to move the country in the right direction in the aftermath of this, or during this current economic crisis?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about that issue to some degree. As I mentioned, I'll just say a bit more on one sector, for example, which is agriculture. I think agriculture is a sector which is broad-based. It touches the highest fraction of the population. And if the government were to focus on this sector, and really when I say focus on this sector, the key thing is technology. The level of productivity in the agriculture sector in Pakistan is quite low by regional standards, certainly by international standards. And there are some relatively low lying fruit here that can benefit the economy as well as the people. Simple things, for example, more efficient use of water, using satellite data to understand better which farms are doing better, which farms are not doing as well. I know Faizan here has done work on that. Solving the problem of cash flows not being collateralizable for farmers who are not landowners, who are tenant farming, which is a large sector of farmers. Because they cannot pledge their cash flows, they are unable to invest in the crop at the key moments of the crop cycle. Those kind of probably, we have the technology now, the digital technology and so on, where those problems have been and can be solved. But there needs to be more of a sort of a collective effort to put in the infrastructure, build the systems where the farmers are able to, as I said, collateralize their cash flow and bring in the early investment that they need. So agriculture is clearly one sector where the government can focus on right away. It's a sector that already exists, and it will have a major impact in terms of both balance of payment and also the local economy.
The next question is, what are the key activities that generate value for India and Bangladesh, and can Pakistan learn from its neighbors?
Well, for Bangladesh, we know what it is. It's textile, basically. It's textile, right? It's an interesting example. Again, when we were talking about, creating a sector which is productive, it's exportable, and then you don't have the kind of problems that Pakistan has had. Now, Pakistan has also had a textile sector for quite a long time, but it has sort of failed to keep up to the potential that it had, and certainly other countries like Bangladesh have done much better. I think it goes back to some of the earlier issues that I was talking about, that again, if you talk to people on the ground in Pakistan, they're like, I can make more money by just speculating in land. Why do I need to make an investment in textile? And that itself is a result of some of the bad policies. Again, so sort of when you have those kind of, for a long time that Pakistan had those exchange rate policies where Pakistan had an appreciated real exchange rate, that promotes these kind of incentives, that you're much better off investing in the local non-tradable, which is what land is, as opposed to doing so in the textile sector. And so those kind of policies have hurt Pakistan in the long run, which is again why I started off by saying that it has to be communicated. You know, Pakistan has an independent central bank now. You know, independence obviously is always kind of, you know, give and take, is never guaranteed for always. But I think it needs to add credibility by putting in a strong board of governors, for example, that communicates to the rest of the world that no, we are going to have this policy where we are not going to now go back to sort of protecting the unproductive sectors, and we are going to now, for the long run, promote the more productive sectors. I think that's the kind of policy that Pakistan needs. I mean, the same question on the Indian side is, again, it's the IT sector, right? And so it's the investment in, you know, we know the IITs network in India, and overall investment in science and technology has been significantly higher in India relative to Pakistan. And that has made a big difference over the long run. More generally, I mean, I think there is this sense in India, which is missing in Pakistan, which is there are attempts on a continuous basis to bring in value chains inside the country. In Pakistan, you don't see that effort to the same degree. And so in Pakistan, when you see, okay, you know what, we need energy, we need roads, we need metro or buses and so on, the reflexive reaction of politicians in Pakistan is, let's buy it from somewhere. So we can import buses from Turkey, or the road network from Korea, power plants from China, and so on. And there is less of a willingness to start building some of, I understand, obviously you want to bring in foreign technology and so on, but you want to do it in a way that you create a domestic manufacturing sector, you create the know-how domestically inside Pakistan as well. Like, even if you look at how the way CPEC is being done, right? It's not having as much of a dynamic positive impact on the economy because it's not adding as much to the know-how of the local people. You know, they come, they build, and they go away. That's not going to have as much of a positive impact on the GDP. So I think we need that fundamental shift in thinking, that the focus needs to be on productive investments.
Okay, so the next question is on foreign aid at Pakistan. And the question is, every time Pakistan has been in an IMF program, there have been strings attached. How do you assess the IMF's policy recommendations, and have they ever been effective in curing the ailing disease?
Yeah, the short answer is no. I mean, it's quite, the proof is, you know, Pakistan has been in 13 IMF programs. And obviously, if they were successful, then we would have stopped at N-1, but we keep having an additional, the need for an additional IMF program. So I've already mentioned a number of the reasons why those programs have failed, but let's talk a little bit about IMF conditions and what role they may have played. I would criticize IMF conditionalities on two scores. The first one is revenue generation. The IMF, you know, obviously there have been 13 programs, so conditionality to some degree vary from program to program, but one common theme is to try and generate revenue through indirect taxation of sorts, including, you know, by imposing higher fees on utility, power, and so on. Now, the typical argument for that is that the power that Pakistan is producing is costly, and the people are not paying the true cost of power. Now, that's true. But the problem is that Pakistan is producing power the wrong way. And so if you try to solve that initial sin by imposing this financial sustainability of that specific program, that's going to backfire. Because the problem is when you impose higher taxes and so on utility, those higher revenue mechanisms are highly regressive in nature. And so that becomes unsustainable from a balance of payment perspective in particular, because balance of payment, Pakistan's balance of payment, it's not the poor who are importing to the first degree. It's really the upper end of the income distribution that puts the pressure on import of oil, cars, and so on and so forth. So if you try to solve that problem by putting a regressive taxation system, that's not going to have a positive impact on the long run. Now, you do need to raise revenue, but I would put in place revenue mechanisms that are a lot more progressive in nature than the kind that IMF typically imposes on Pakistan. So that's sort of criticism number one, if you will, of IMF conditions. The second criticism I would have of IMF conditions is on the sort of the fiscal deficit targets. Those deficit targets include capital expenditure as well, which actually does not happen in the rest of the world. It's very interesting. If you look at developed countries' own books, for example, they don't include capital expenditure typically in the deficit calculations. Why? The simple reason is, if it's capital expenditure, it's supposed to have positive NPV, that it's going to have it's not pure consumption basically. So you have a return on the other side of that investment, as long as you're doing it well. So so every time those conditions are imposed, Pakistan's investment, public investment, has to shrink correspondingly. That, I think, is negative. Now, you can argue, well, Pakistan does not maintain discipline, so how else would you do it? Well, there is another way to do it, which is by all means impose discipline. But the way I would impose that discipline is, you say, okay, you need this investment, but here are there are going to be some external rules of how this investment has to be made. You can have an external board of governors that sanctions on, so you can come up with other mechanisms, but you can't just restrict the level of public investment that a growing economy like Pakistan needs, because then it becomes self-defeating. If you're not going to have growth, you can't grow out of these kind of problems that Pakistan has historically faced.
The next set of questions is sort of related to your current answer and the previous answer, which is, how do we assess the role of the state in stimulating Pakistan's economy? So, for example, one question is, how has state protectionism impacted the Pakistani economy? And the example that the question gives is the auto industry, which has been protected from competition through tariffs, but without much to show for it. Another aspect of the economy is the public sector in terms of infrastructural investment. So you brought up the example of, for example, importing buses from Turkey as opposed to doing something within Pakistan. So how do we sort of assess the state's role in both protectionism as well as stimulating growth through infrastructural investment in a more effective way?
Yeah. My reading of the history of development across the world is that you cannot bypass the state. I mean, if you look at the major success stories of development and growth, state has been involved in a very sort of explicit manner. Having said that, we also know the opposite, which is a number of stories of stagnation and so on. It's the state that is to blame. And so that's the real challenge. People often talk about privatization, for example, as a solution, or removal of subsidies and so on. Subsidies on sugarcane or the auto sector, they make no sense in the Pakistani context, and they should be removed and so on. But I think the broader problem is not that privatization or these removal of subsidies by itself will solve everything. It will not. I think you do need to address the other issue, which is there is a bunch of stuff that the state needs to provide, and you just cannot run away from that. What we have had over time is that the state has been abdicating its responsibility from one sector to another, to an extent that now everything has been privatized, whether it comes to education, health, water, transport, things of that nature. That's just not sustainable in a country like Pakistan with so much poverty, and so on. So we do need to invest in the state as well, in terms of increasing the capacity of the state, and which is which is exactly why I was emphasizing this point of personnel is policy. I mean, I think it is important that the government puts in place, for various institutions, boards of governors of the right set of people who help in making decisions. So, you have this mix of private and public through a non-profit organization or independent board of governors and so on. We have various mechanisms that work around the world. The state cannot abdicate its sort of role in some of the key areas of society that I have mentioned. And so again, it's a balance. State does need to get out of providing rents to the unproductive elite that I've already mentioned. But on the other side, it does need to put in place the public investments that are needed to crowd in private investment in sectors such as agriculture, IT, and energy in particular that I mentioned earlier.
So these are a lot of discussions of sort of long-term policies. Looking towards the short term, there's one question, which is how can Pakistan reduce its inflation in the short term?
Well, I think the solution to solving, I don't see inflation separately or independently from the balance of payment problem. I don't see inflation as an independent problem, basically. I think inflation is a natural consequence of the unsustainable external balance environment that Pakistan has, coupled with, of course, the very large fiscal deficit that the country has been running. Again, I do believe that a stronger, more progressive system of taxation would help on both. I've already mentioned the external account, but it would also help on the inflation dynamics. And again, I think taxing land and capital gains on land in particular would go a significant way in sort of moving the needle in the right direction.
We may have time for one final question.
Okay, so our final question is, what do you think the impact of political uncertainty is on the current state of the Pakistani economy?
Yeah, so the question is one of political uncertainty and its impact on Pakistan's economy. It has had a very significant impact on Pakistan, that's for sure. However, political uncertainty, to at least some degree, is itself a result of the lack of success of various political parties who come to power. I can't think of, people talk about no government tends to complete its tenure in Pakistan, and that's true, obviously. But at the same time, it's also hard to think of a very successful political tenure that then artificially ended. So I think it's the fact that the parties, when they do come to power, that they are unable to manage the situation that they are given, that results in giving someone else the excuse to kind of, shake the room, so to speak, and for someone else to come to power. So partly it's a function of poor decision making. I've sometimes talked about sort of the importance of having a well-functioning nervous system that makes the right decisions. But you repeatedly see political parties making bad economic decisions. So for example, energy policy, I've talked about energy policy a number of times. Successive governments put in place a power policy which essentially bought power from or imported power by promising very high rates of return in dollar terms. That was essentially unsustainable. Again, it's fossil fuel based, you're importing the fuel and you're promising a very high rate of return to all the investors who are coming in. You cannot afford that electricity. And so you're going to run deficits, you're going to sort of run into both balance of payment issues and fiscal issues because you will not be able to pay for that electricity. So these are examples of poor policy. So first of all, I think if the political parties mature a bit in their own decision making, that would help reduce the level of political uncertainty. The other aspect of political uncertainty is that sometimes you just have to let the system go a number of times before it settles on some level of maturity. I mean, Bangladesh is one example where the system the military has been in there, and then the two political parties, they keep fighting and so on. but they seem to have come to an equilibrium of sorts where they have a lot more stability now than they have had in the past. So this is, I think, one of the most difficult questions, that we don't have as good a sense of how do you transition from an unstable to a stable system. But you certainly have to hope that ultimately you will get there. And better decision making certainly helps in making even a bad political system more durable. And we've seen this in other countries. So we're recently talking to someone from Vietnam, and there it's a communist party and so on, but people are okay with it. Why? Because it's delivering a high rate of growth, and so people are sort of happy with the status quo. If they don't have that level of growth, it will be much harder for that government to survive.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions, Professor Mian. Unfortunately, we are at the hour. It is 9 p.m. here in New Jersey. So thank you for staying with us all this while. For folks who are joining from Pakistan, it's probably 6 a.m. So if you're joining, kudos to you for staying awake and listening to us. We probably had a lot more questions that we couldn't answer, but we'll definitely take a look at them later. Thank you once again for your time, and for everyone else who joined online, and everyone who's been here in person.
Thank you, everyone.